Well, despite rent prices continuing to fall back down to earth, the gap continues to widen for those struggling to afford to put a roof over their heads. The latest numbers from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives out this morning show that a full-time worker in Toronto would need to make $38 per hour to be able to afford just a one-bedroom unit. So joining us live now for a close look at those numbers is David Macdonald, Senior Economist at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, or CCPA. David, appreciate the time this morning. Toronto and Vancouver, time and time again, we hear about the unaffordability of real estate here. A lot of that is when you think about people buying, but even for people renting, these are expensive cities, aren't they?
They're extraordinarily expensive, that's right. And so if you're working minimum wage, it's basically impossible for you to spend the recommended 30% of your income on rent. We looked in Toronto at over 100 neighborhoods. In 0 of the 100 neighborhoods in Toronto could you afford a one-bedroom apartment, much less a two-bedroom apartment. So there aren't even those pockets of affordability that may have existed in the past. And in essence, if you wanted to afford a one-bedroom apartment in Toronto and not pay more than 30% of your income on rent, you'd have to make about $80,000. And so, these are extraordinarily unaffordable levels. You can't work 2 to 3 minimum wage jobs just to pay these amounts. And so there are real impacts for folks living in Toronto if you can't afford the basics in terms of a roof over your head.
Yeah, and David, how rare or uncommon is it that basically no neighborhood in a city is effectively affordable for people working a reasonable minimum wage job?
Unfortunately, it's incredibly common in Canada. There are, of the 62 cities we looked at, there were 8 where you could afford a one-bedroom apartment working minimum wage in that province. Most of actually were smaller towns in Quebec. But in most cities in Canada now, if you're working minimum wage, it's not enough to afford the basics of a one-bedroom apartment. And so you're spending well more than 30% of your income on rent, which means you got less money to spend on everything else.
I suppose so. Okay, so David, yesterday at the Liberal cabinet retreat, they had some, national pollsters there, and they were saying that while the Trump tariffs remain big, it's still cost of living, affordability. Those are some of the big issues that Canadians are saying are the priority. So as the government is, or the cabinet at least, Carney cabinet sitting around Toronto today discussing things, what sort of suggestions or policy alternatives, to use the title of your organization, could be put forward to help Canadians struggling to make rent?
This government has already acted very decisively on defense, massive new expenditures on defense immediately. This isn't something they're phasing in over time. It's billions of dollars immediately into defense. We haven't seen at this point that level of decisiveness on things like rental housing. There were some great ideas in the Liberal platform of the federal government becoming a housing developer, in essence, skipping the middleman, if you will, skipping the private sector developers and developing new affordable units themselves in order to cut down the costs across the entire stack when it comes to land costs, when it comes to construction costs, financing costs. These are all places where the federal government could reduce costs and potentially speed up development. So I think that's a great idea and something that should absolutely be pursued. At this point, though, we don't have a timeline. We don't have a budget. So now it's time to act decisively on housing like we have already on defense.
Yeah, I suppose we'll get the federal budget coming up in October. But in the meantime, there's no quick solution, is there, David? Because as with housing, supply is the issue, and you can't build homes kind of overnight.
Things like rent control can be important in terms of limiting the increases in rents over time. Part of the issue there is that the rents have already gone up. And so even if you closed a lot of the loopholes on rent control, like exist in Ontario, in a sense, it doesn't matter because the rent increases are behind us and we're now at just a new higher level of rent. We could also discuss higher minimum wages, but it's pretty unlikely that we're going to get a $40 minimum wage in Toronto anytime soon. We're sitting about 17 at this point.
Okay, David, appreciate you helping break down these numbers for us. That's David Macdonald, Senior Economist at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. Thanks for the time this morning.